Hi and welcome to Chandu.org. Today let us understand a very interesting problem and see how to work the solution for it using various Excel formula techniques. This problem is called as Billy's working hours problem. The problem is very simple. Imagine you are looking at a timesheet or hours worked kind of sheet or an invoice from a contractor or something like that, where each line item indicates starting and ending time of a particular task. So for example, imagine you are running a company where Billy is one of the employees, and Billy sends you every week an Excel file that says on each day of the week how many hours Billy worked. So it would have like 8 a.m. Billy started working and 6 p.m. he left the office. So the total hours in that case would be 10, because he arrived in the morning 8 a.m. and he left the office evening 6 o'clock. So there are 10 hours in that time span, right? So if you're looking at something like that and you wanted to find out the total number of hours within a range, what kind of formula techniques you would use? Now the real twist here is, as long as you're looking at hours that are ending within one day, you're fine. But what if you're looking at something like Billy started working at 9 p.m. and ended the work at 3 a.m. in the morning? In that case, turns out you can't really do a direct subtraction because you would end up with what is called as a negative time in most cases. So I'm going to show you an example file and walk you through the process of coming up with a solution. And let us understand various techniques that will go with this. I'm going to insert a column here, and so we are looking at, for the time being, ignore that section, and we are looking at various start and end times. Now Billy started at 8 a.m. and ended at 3 p.m. so obviously the difference would be that minus that, which is, if you format it in hours, that will be 7 hours. Okay, and if you started dragging down, somewhere along the line you started seeing these bunch of hashes, which means if you point your mouse pointer, you can read the message. This is dates and times that are negative or too large are displayed as hash 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 hash. In this case we are talking about subtracting 5 a.m. 9 p.m. from 5 a.m. because 5 a.m. occurs before 9 p.m. we end up with a negative number which cannot be formatted as time, hence that error. You might be thinking, oh, big deal, I'm going to just sum it up, and you might sum up this entire range. You might get some value, but that's incorrect too. In this case I think the number is incorrect and it's negative. So for this reason you need to come up with some sort of a formula that will incorporate an additional check at the midnight, right? If you are beyond midnight and the times are on either side of midnight, you need to write a special formula. That's what we need to do. Now there are many techniques for this. Essentially the way this would work is we will start counting the hours until midnight, and then from midnight onwards we will start counting again. Because we cannot do a simple subtraction, we need to come up with various techniques. So the first formula is called as an if formula. This is the obvious one. Here what we are saying is, if my end time is after the start time, I want the difference between these two. Okay, this would be true in most cases, but around the midnight mark what happens is end time would be before the start time. In that case what we want is, we want to get the result by 1 minus start time plus end time, right? So this is in other words, if you write the formula start minus end here, you're going to get 4 p.m. which is equivalent to 16 hours, but the working hours are 8, not 16. So to get the correct answer, which is 8, we need to subtract 1 minus 16. 1 means 24 hours, so 1 minus 16 hours would be 8 hours. Okay, so that's the logic here. So those of you who are new to Excel dates, just keep in mind that each day is one number. So 1 corresponds to one day, 2 is the next day. So if 1 is today, 2 is tomorrow. Now what would be 1.2? That is, well, 1 is really midnight of today and 2 is the midnight of tomorrow. So 1.2 would be 0.2 portion of a day. In other words, that is nothing but 0.2 multiplied by 24. So it is 4.8 hours after the midnight, right? Roughly 5 a.m. in the morning. So that's how the hour, date and time calculations work in Excel. Everything is just a number. So when you're dealing with a date and you wanted to get the number of hours by subtracting from 1, all you're really doing is subtracting from 24 hours to get that. Okay, so that's that value. Now by default this calculation would look something like that. It wouldn't look like 7, it will look like 0.291, which means the portion of the day that is worked by Billy is 0.29, or he worked for 29% of that day. Well, that is not easy to understand for us human beings. We would rather see this as 7 hours or 6 hours. So to make that happen, you need to select that and format the cells. You can right click and say format cells, or you can press Ctrl 1 and then go to custom and use the code HMM. Okay, so that will give you in hours how many hours Billy has worked. You need to put that in square brackets so that it will show up total hours, and that will work when you are looking at 44. Otherwise what happens is you would see something like 44 when divided by 24, whatever is that remainder, which will be 20, right? So that's why we are using the square bracket notation. Now I don't want to complicate things at the format level. This can be understood and applied in a different context also, but this is how the if formula works. We take the column value in D and then subtract from C, but we will only do that as long as end time is after the start time. If that's not the case, we want it 1 minus C5 plus D5. Okay, so that's the if formula. Now if you are thinking, isn't there maybe a shorter version of this formula? Well, there is. You could use alternatively mod formula. What this does is it takes the subtraction of D5 minus C5 and then it asks Excel what would be the remainder when I divide this with 1, and what would be the remainder. That's what the mod formula does. Now for positive numbers it will be the number of hours, but for negative numbers it will be the 1 minus of that. So essentially the mod formula is working exactly like if formula, but it is a lot shorter and crispier and smaller version of that thing. It looks very simple, but what it is doing is it is handling both positive and negative cases with elegance. Now here comes the third formula, which is equally elegant and may be very interesting to study. This uses simple arithmetic along with the less than condition. Instead of using if formula, what we have done here is we are simply saying D5 minus C5 plus within brackets D5 less than or equal to C5. So we are asking Excel, hey, calculate D5 minus C5 and then add to it a number which is equivalent to is D5 less than C5. So what happens is throughout the day, when the times are both start and end times are within the same day, you will have this portion as false, the D5 less than or equal to C5 portion as false. When false is added to a numeric value, false would be converted into number representation, which is 0. So this result won't change. But around midnight portion, when the times are overlapping from both sides of the midnight, what would then happen is this will be true, which will be 1. So now we will get D8 minus C8 plus 1. In other words, we'll get 1 minus C8 plus D8. Okay. So this is also really mimicking the if formula, but instead of using the if logic, everything is written in a very compact, simplified formula so that you could get something like this. Okay. The other formula that I have come across is using if error formula, because when you have a negative time, all the time calculations like how many hours are there would be returning an error. So we are saying if error hour of D5 minus C5, how many hours that is. If that formula is an error, that means D5 minus C5 is a negative number. In that case, what we want is 24 minus hour of C5 minus D5. So essentially this is like the if formula part, but here the key difference is uh, excuse me. Here the key difference is this function will return a fraction, as you have seen. Whereas this function returns a number, it will always be 7 hours. So it's not returning a fraction, it is returning the number. So that is the main difference between these two things. So this is how you can calculate working hours when you have a mix of situations. Both start and end times on the same day, as well as they span 2 different dates. Now the key thing to remember in all this setup is that these are just raw times. There is no date portion attached to it. Okay, so somebody went to the Excel worksheet and they just typed 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m. like that. When that happens, you could use these logic. But if you have something a little more complex, like both the date and time, like a timestamp is there. For example, you have something like 19th of June 2015, 10 a.m. That's my start time. And my end time is 19th of June 2005, you know what, on 20th of June. So we started this on 10 a.m. on 19th June and we ended it on 2 a.m. in the midnight. So if you have something like this, you don't need to do anything. You simply subtract this minus that, and that will always give you the correct answer, which is you worked for 67% of the day. Or in other words, if I format this, we worked for 16 hours. Okay, so this will work because here both date and time portions are there, so Excel can calculate correctly because this time is always after that time. If you omit the time portion, if you omit the date portion and just enter only the time part, like the way we have done here, in such case, by default Excel will assume it's the 4 a.m. on the 0th day of Excel time world, because time is missing, so it's 0th day. So 4 a.m. will be always before 8 p.m. and hence the complication. Now let me throw a small wrench into this setup. What if you have to accommodate some lunch breaks as well? Let us say we give our employees a lunch break. Whenever they work more than 6 hours in a day, they can take 1 hour break. Okay, this is a very standard policy. So if your shift is less than 6 hours, you don't have lunch break. You just show up, finish your work and go home. But if you're working longer than 6 hours, even 1 second, you get to have 1 hour break. Okay, so let's say you have something like this. In such case, how do we calculate the total hours? Well, it's very simple. We will use a similar formula. This is mod of D5 minus C5 comma 1 minus and we wanted to reduce that amount by 1 hour provided our duration is greater than 6. So we are saying mod of D5 minus 65 comma 1 is greater than 6. If so, multiply it with 1. So what this would be is, this will be false whenever we have worked, the person has worked less than 6 hours. So that way it will be false for all the days when there is less than 6 hours of work done. And because this is false, when you multiply false with 1, the duration of break time, because false is 0, essentially the time subtracted is 0. But whenever this is true, that means we have worked more than 6 hours, you would subtract the break time from the total duration. So the total hours worked would calculate accordingly. Again, this is a very, very simple but very innovative formula. Now, before I wrap up this video, I just want to say thanks to a couple of people. Mickey for suggesting the mod formula, and a few other commenters on Chendu.org who came up with the less than version and if error formulas, and Mickey for coming up with the lunch twist and sharing that formula as well. So thank you so much for all your contributions, and I hope you enjoyed the Billy's working hour problem. This is a really interesting problem. It doesn't seem like a complex one until you start thinking about it, and once you start thinking about it, you could come up with variations that are very straightforward, like the if formula, or somewhat interesting, like the less than formula, or even something unusual like the if error formula, and all of them can be used to calculate the working hours. So all the best, and stay awesome. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.